Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 52 Weeks of Leadership. My name is Molly Anderson. I serve as the Executive Director of UB Center for Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness. And we are delighted that you'll join us each week for our special programs featuring faculty and experts from around the world on topics of leadership. We think this is a great new tradition in 2021 to give you what you need to lead. And all of our volunteers and special guests have been volunteering their time because they're so committed to the area of leadership and helping others improve. So we are thrilled today to have Professor Emily Grijalva as our speaker. Today, she's going to be talking about leadership and narcissism. And she is primarily focused on the topic of narcissism in her research, as well as leadership and gender. You may have heard of her. She's widely published in top management and psychology journals. She's been featured in popular press outlets such as Time, The Washington Post, NPR Marketplace, and Associated Press, and she's won several awards, including the Network of Leadership Scholars Award. Thrilled to have her part of this series and part of the University of Buffalo School of Management. She's going to be talking for about 15-20 minutes and leaving room for some questions. So feel free to think of questions, add them to the chat, and we'll have time to get to those at the end. All right, let's turn it over to Emily. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I'm excited you're here to learn a little bit more about should I try to be more narcissistic? A study was published a couple years ago, which found that narcissists tend to be mentally tough and have less stress. Findings that were picked up by the popular press and appeared in outlets like Psychology Today, Newsweek, NBC. While I understand it is interesting to consider the positive side of what's traditionally considered to be a negative trait, I started to get a little concerned when a journalist asked me for tips about how people could go about cultivating their narcissism, how to be more narcissistic. This just felt so wrong, but is it actually good advice? Perhaps I shouldn't discount it so quickly if narcissism has legitimate advantages. That's what I'm going to delve into in my talk today. What are the advantages and disadvantages of narcissism, particularly for leaders? One of my favorite examples of a narcissistic leader is Steve Jobs. He's great at embodying all the complexity that goes into this topic. Part of his success as the co-founder of Apple has been attributed to his incredible charisma, which enabled him to inspire tremendous loyalty and overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Yet for all his positive qualities, he was no saint, as we know, and he's been criticized for his abrasive interpersonal style, especially as a manager. Known for being an exacting perfectionist, it frequently insulted and sometimes publicly humiliated followers who didn't live up to his high standards. Part of what makes narcissistic leaders like Steve Jobs so fascinating is that they embody positive qualities like charisma and self-confidence that are accompanied by negative qualities like arrogance and exploitativeness, both of which could arguably affect leader performance. One of the questions that I want to address with my talk today is, despite these contradictions, in general, if someone is a narcissist, are they likely to be a good leader? How does this relate to leader character? And ultimately, should you be trying to cultivate your narcissism to be a better leader? Before I get too far, however, I want to clarify what I mean by narcissism. There can be some different ideas surrounding this topic. When I'm talking about it, I'm referring to a personality trait that exists on a spectrum from low to high levels, and not a personality disorder where you either have it or you don't. Trait narcissism is associated with a grandiose sense of self-importance, entitlement, and exploitativeness. These are individuals who tend to be a little self-centered and put their own interests before those of others. I bet many of you in the audience today during your career have had some experiences working with people like this in a leadership role. And I would be fascinated after the talk ends to hear about your experiences. So was that person a high performer? How did they treat their employees? Really, what was it like to work with them? In terms of what the research says, there is a lot of inconsistency, really a surprising amount of inconsistency. Some studies show that narcissists actually tend to be better leaders. Other studies show that they tend to be ineffective in leadership roles. And I realized that there exist reasonable explanations for narcissism having both a positive and a negative relationship with leadership performance. On the positive side, we tend to choose our leaders based on how well an individual's characteristics match a prototypical leader. And in fact, many of narcissists' characteristics are stereotypically leader-like, for example, being dominant, self-confident, and outgoing. Research has even identified specific perceptual cues narcissists give off that identify them as leader-like to others, and these include being well-dressed, having a self-confident facial expression, and even the use of verbal humor, all of which makes them appear to be charming and likable. Michael Maccabee, in a Harvard Business Review paper, even suggested that you cannot be a great leader without some degree of narcissism because you need to believe you're special in order to gain followers' trust. Beyond matching the leader prototype, being self-confident and charismatic helps narcissists to create a great first impression. These are individuals that tend to perform well in job interviews, so beware. In addition, finally, narcissists seem to be able to bend reality in their favor. They are very good at convincing other people to see things the way that they see them. Arguably an important skill for leaders who need to be able to convince followers to pursue common goals. Steve Jobs himself was said to have a reality distortion field that one of his employees described like this. In Jobs' presence, reality is malleable. He can convince anyone of practically anything. It wears off when he's not around, but it makes it hard to have realistic schedules. Altogether, then, it becomes clear that narcissists can be quite charismatic and that there are situations when they can convince their followers that it's possible to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. What then, however, are the downsides of narcissism? The reasons why it might be maladaptive are really relatively intuitive. And it goes back to a lot of those negative interpersonal characteristics that I already mentioned to you. For example, being entitled, exploitative, arrogant. Another one is lacking empathy for others. It really does not take an expert to see that these are interpersonally toxic attributes. And the research supports this. Although narcissists make a positive first impression, this deteriorates over time as people get to know them better. There's a classic study that documents this phenomenon. It followed small groups over 7 consecutive weeks. After the first week, narcissists are described quite positively, using adjectives like confident, entertaining, physically attractive. However, by the end of the study, people's perceptions of narcissists had changed. They began to describe them more negatively with adjectives like hostile, arrogant, and cold. They also contributed that they hadn't contributed to group goals. And importantly, they appeared to be psychologically unhealthy. Narcissist interpersonal deficits are important to consider because they might affect the quality of leaders' relationships with their followers. No one wants to work for a selfish, inconsiderate boss. And the quality of the relationships that leaders build with their followers are really important in terms of followers' job performance. From this perspective, then, you might expect that leaders would have a negative relation, or narcissism would have a negative relationship with leader performance. And that would be through this interpersonal aspect of leadership. To make sense of all of these competing explanations and the inconsistent body of work, I decided to perform an empirical synthesis where I looked at all of the available data on this topic. I was looking here, I did this aggregation to look at some overall trends. My summary of the research revealed some interesting things. First, narcissism is positively related to leadership emergence. That is, individuals who are higher in narcissism are more likely to be perceived as a leader, particularly when you don't know them well. And this wasn't too surprising. This made sense and cohered with all that research showing that narcissists make a positive first impression. However, I also found that narcissism is unrelated to leadership effectiveness, or how well someone actually performs in a leadership role. If someone's high in narcissism, they're no more or less likely to be an effective leader. This I found surprising. And so surprising, in fact, that I decided to conduct a second study. For the second study, I used data that was gathered from 6 different organizations and over 1,700 employees. I explored the idea here. All right, so we know narcissism does not have a linear relationship with leadership performance, but maybe this is masking a curvilinear trend. And in fact, that's what I found. An inverted U-shaped relationship between narcissism and performance, which means that narcissism, a traditionally negative trait, is actually best in moderation. Very low levels could lead to insecure, hesitant leaders, and very high levels could lead to arrogant, tyrannical leaders. So I just told you narcissists are more likely to emerge into leadership roles. In moderation, it's associated with leadership effectiveness. Some might then conclude that they should become more narcissistic in order to be a better leader. But I would caution you against drawing this conclusion for several reasons. Importantly, narcissism has quite a few disadvantages, both for the narcissists themselves and for society as a whole. Although narcissists self-report being mentally tough and having less stress, this is based on their own self-perceptions, and I think we have to admit it might not be entirely accurate. Recall that other study I showed you where when observers got to know the narcissist better, they began to think of them as being psychologically unhealthy. Even if it were true that narcissists experience less stress, this comes at no small cost because these individuals have trouble maintaining positive interpersonal relationships in both love and work. Generally, this is considered to be the case because they're less empathetic, caring, and considerate of others. They're also more likely to respond aggressively to ego threats, fiercely lashing out at anyone who undermines their positive self-image. Perhaps then, narcissists consider themselves to be mentally tough because they consistently distort reality, inflating their accomplishments, overlooking their flaws, and blaming other people for their failures. Another important thing to keep in mind about narcissism is that it's associated with a vast array of unethical behaviors. And in fact, it is one of the leading variables you can use to predict whether someone will engage in unethical behaviors at work or behaviors designed to undermine an organization's goals, such as absenteeism, theft, and fraud. Specifically, there's research showing that narcissists engage in more academic dishonesty, white-collar crime, and financial misreporting. I'm highlighting these unethical behaviors because it's important to consider, arguably important to consider leader character when you're trying to determine the qualities that make someone a good leader. Turning back to the question I asked at the beginning of my talk, should you cultivate your narcissism in order to become a better leader? Assuming that you value leader character, my recommendation would be no. And in fact, I instead recommend that you develop your humility. In many ways, humility exists at the opposite end of the continuum from narcissism. It involves things like having an accurate self-image, other appreciation, and valuing other people's ideas and perspectives. But you shouldn't just try to be humble out of the goodness of your heart or to be virtuous. Humility is also a good predictor of leader performance. Whereas narcissism primarily has short-term gains and many long-term disadvantages, humility has an overwhelmingly positive impact on the leaders and the organizations that they lead. To name just a couple of these, they have more engaged, committed, and higher performing employees. Also, from a societal standpoint, it's great to recommend people enhance their humility because it can be a buffer against some of that unethical and selfish behavior I mentioned that can become tempting when people are in positions of power. In order to embody humility, I recommend that you try to engage in some of the behaviors associated with the 3 core elements of humility. So here it is the willingness to view oneself accurately, and appreciation for others, and modeling teachability. So here, one piece of advice, for example, would be to actively seek out 360-degree feedback. Take that feedback seriously, and especially any criticism. Second, try to consistently provide appreciation for followers, letting them know, in particular, when they've done something well. And then finally, trying to be open to new ideas and perspectives. And this is hard for everyone, but just really trying to focus on that even when it might be threatening to take that feedback or advice. It is, we're all a little bit narcissistic, and it's only natural to be selfish sometimes. But if you take one thing away from my talk today, it would be that you shouldn't be striving to be more narcissistic. Strive to be humble, because humility is a more reliable and robust predictor of leadership outcomes than narcissism. All right, so I made it through my material pretty quickly today. I wanted to provide some time to allow you to ask some questions. I hope people felt like they learned something new, and I'm fascinated to know about your own experiences, any questions you might have about this.
While I give people an opportunity to think about some questions, I want to thank you, Emily, for a great presentation and use of this fantastic green screen behind you and all of your beautiful slides. I see we've got some questions now, so I stalled long enough. So we have a question from Human Resources. What suggestions do you have to help someone understand their narcissism?
Yeah, I think that can be really challenging if someone is high in. So if you're just curious, you can go online and easily find some surveys. So you could just type in narcissism survey and get some feedback on that. I think Time actually has an open survey where you can get feedback. If you're struggling with employees that are highly narcissistic, I've thought a lot about how you can intervene with these individuals because they aggressively lash out at negative feedback. And I think we all take negative feedback a little bit, it's difficult for everyone, but I would try to emphasize what the person can do differently that would help them perform better and meet goals that they have. So for example, if they're having a difficult time relating to employees, you can emphasize that the relationships that they're building with those employees that go into their annual evaluation, they are, important to their own performance, their own goals that they're trying to meet. And that's just part of how they will get higher pay or whatever it is that they're interested in obtaining, trying to make sure that those goals are aligned. I've also seen suggestions that in terms of trying to promote better behavior, you link it to monetary incentives that kind of are team-based so that you try to encourage them to treat the team members well. I've seen this go poorly because if you make people work together who aren't great with working together, that can also backfire. So it kind of might depend upon the person's individual characteristics as well when you're just trying to determine how to intervene. But this is, I think, a great area of research. It's not been well examined. So this is kind of the next phase of some of the research I'm doing.
Thank you. Our next question is from Aaron Feeblecore, and he asks, have you found any correlation of high narcissism and psychopathy? Could that skew some of your findings?
I don't know if it would skew the findings because narcissism and psychopathy are correlated. And I always think to be a psychopath, you're also almost by definition narcissistic. But narcissism, they're not the same thing. So you can be narcissistic, you can be self-centered without some of those really deviant antisocial behaviors associated with hurting others, which is really what we think about psychopathy. Psychopathy is also a little different because it tends to have very low control over behaviors, emotions, that kind of thing. And so they are slightly different traits, although correlated. We call the dark triad psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. Psychopathy is worse than narcissism.
Thank you. Our next question is from Robin. My experience is that narcissistic leaders are very good at brown nosing and managing up, and thus senior leadership may not see their narcissistic attributes of mid-level managers. Have you seen this, and what advice do you have for someone working for such a leader?
Yes, I think that is huge. I think it's very true. That's a trend that's seen over and over, that narcissists are strategic in their relationships that they build. What I would recommend is perhaps recommending 360-degree feedbacks for organizations that might have some problems with narcissism, making sure that you get multiple sources of report from people at the same level and lower level employees, so that there's a buffer in terms of who they know is reporting, but you also are getting multiple perspectives. And I think that's good for any organization in general, because like I said, narcissists tend to emerge into leadership roles. This is because they're considered leader-like, but also because they are highly motivated to achieve positions of power and influence. And so they are going to try to self-select into those positions, and organizations are going to have to, at some point or another, actively decide how they want to decide with people, what to do with people like this who might be having trouble maintaining positive interpersonal relationships with lower level employees.
Erica asks, how can you recognize a narcissist in the early stages so you can avoid going into business with them?
I think that's a really good question. I look personally for blamer mentality. So when I'm doing hiring, I like to see what people say about other relationships they've had, professional relationships they've had in the past. If someone's saying, oh, I didn't like my last job because blah, 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 blah. Sometimes I think, maybe they really just had a terrible job, but it's also a red flag for me as well. It's very hard with narcissism because some people are just charismatic. They're just outgoing and likable, and there's no negative side. Sometimes another thing I do is I try, before going all in with a relationship, I try to get to know them through multiple interviews or multiple social gatherings. And, sometimes you can maintain a facade for a while, but it's difficult to do long term. You could also try and see if you're starting a business relationship, if you can get other people's perspectives who've worked with that person in the past longer term.
Thank you. Arlene asked, are there any insights on variations by gender, age, or other demographics?
I have a paper showing that men tend to be slightly more narcissistic than women in general. Of course, this is not true for individuals. There are plenty of narcissistic women out there. In addition, narcissism tends to decline as you age. There's lots of research on this as well. So although people are suggesting that the younger generation is more narcissistic than older generations, this is actually not supported by evidence. It's maintained relatively stable over time. It's just that as we age, we become less narcissistic and we forget how narcissistic we were when we were young. And so it makes it seem like the younger generation is getting worse and worse over time. But yeah, it should slowly decline over time.
AJ asks about humility and if it can be sometimes considered a weakness while handling narcissistic team members. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so there's been a suggestion that humility can be a weakness. And humility is a complex trait. And one thing I found as well is the way we really measure it and look at it empirically in the organizational behavior research, we look at it as having this accurate self-image. So it's not having a low self-image or thinking poorly of yourself. It's really just having relative acceptance for your strengths and weaknesses. I think if you look at it like that, it might not be a weakness. It's when it gets into being overly modest to the point of almost having this negative self-perception. But that tends to not be how we look at it in terms of research terms, but more how it's used sometimes colloquially. But there is more research emerging that, you know, humility definitely would not probably be one of those attributes that would be strongly related with emergence. It's going to be associated with being a better leader in the role, but it, in the short term, might not make someone appear to be leader-like, because our leader emergence stereotypes go into confidence. That's a huge one, and dominance, and just how much people talk. Talking more, if you're in a job interview or a leaderless group discussion exercise in something like an assessment center, that would tend to make you appear more leader-like.
Melissa asks, how can organizations balance the behavior of narcissistic leaders with maintaining a positive work environment? In my experience, narcissistic leaders can create a toxic work environment if unchecked. Yeah,
I think, you know, in terms of other advice, if you try to intervene with someone, you try to talk to them about changing their behavior, you try multiple pathways to improving things, but in the end, that person is just really toxic. They're creating an unhealthy workplace for everyone. That's the time when you would need to start thinking about if you need to make a change for the betterment of the entire organization, because that person isn't helping you to build the type of culture that you want in that company. So you can try and change narcissists. I think if they're at almost moderate high, but not high, then you might have some success. But if someone's really, really high, I think it'd be really challenging to change their behavior. Not impossible, but yeah, so it might just be the fact that you have to make a hard decision and let that person go. Right now, I'm working on some research on humbling life experiences, because I was really interested in how to intervene to help people who are high performers really change how they look at their relationships with other people. Because sometimes you see people have transformational life experiences that help with this. So that's kind of a new line of my research that I'm looking at.
Okay, and Rick Steinberg asked, do narcissists tend to project narcissism on others?
I think, yeah, I'm not recalling a specific paper here, but I have a vague recollection that they do, and this is a general trend for us to think other people are like us. There's also this general trend to like people like us. So upon initial acquaintance, narcissists would like other narcissists because they're going to admire their self-confidence, their charisma. Those are things they'll like. In the longer term, I think it could lead to butting heads.
Okay, Michael said, I intend to review your paper. If I were to read one book on dealing with narcissism in the workplace, what would you recommend? Note that I'm not allergic to academic treatments.
Oh, well, I like Snakes in Suits. I think that's kind of an interesting book. It's about the darker side. It's not only about narcissism. But if you email me, I can think some more about this and think about some other papers that might be interesting.
And Whitney asked, she read an article recently with a significant revelation. If you aren't quite sure you are in a relationship with a narcissist, an easy way to identify them is by the broken pieces they leave in their wake, which can drain your mental, physical, and emotional energy. You hear this a lot about people being in narcissistic personal relationships. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think that's a really good point. If you're trying to decide if, just generally, if a relationship is healthy, if the person's constantly tearing you down, and their own need for attention and recognition is leading them to make you feel bad, then that might definitely be a sign, one sign that someone's narcissistic.
Okay, one more question and we'll wrap up. It's from Amy. How do you deal with a narcissist in human resources?
So the person is working in human resources?
I'm thinking maybe from the approach of a human resource manager.
Oh, okay.
Amy, if you have any more to add on that, feel free to add to the chat. Is the HR director?
Okay. So the person has made their way into an important leadership role, and now they're creating a toxic culture that's difficult to change because they're in this position of power. I think that, generally, it's very difficult when the change has to come from the bottom because lower level people are being mistreated. So this is something, I think if it's becoming such a toxic environment, you would have to try to see if other people perceive it similarly. If there's, for example, been a lot of turnover in that area, if there have been some indications that are kind of the behavior that you could slowly accumulate, then you could try and bring in more powerful people to try and exert some kind of change. This is a tough one. It's always tough when it's talking about, a specific situation, because I don't know all the variables and I would want to be kind of cautious about the advice that I give here. Generally, I've found trying to you can reason with narcissists and say, I don't like how you're treating me. That has a moderate level of success because they don't care as much about interpersonal relationships. So it would try to involve someone who's higher level, but you'd have to be careful about how you do it and try to have multiple perspectives and pieces of evidence about the toxic culture that might be resulting from some of the behaviors.
Margaret asked the name of the article that you shared, but I believe it was a book. Was it Snakes and Sharks?
Snakes and Suits.
Suits.
It's a book.
That's a whole
it was
other book
published a
about
couple years
something
ago,
else.
but it was a fun read. It was, it's a lot of it's also about psychopathy as well, but narcissism and psychopathy are related to one another. And like I said, I also have some books. I just started looking at books as well on how to get rid of narcissists in your personal life. So I have some of those because I thought they'd be interesting for my research, and have some tips about how to relate to narcissists at work as well. So I have a couple that I could recommend there. And I actually gave one to a colleague who came to me and said they were struggling with a problem in this area. And so I said, okay, here's this book. And she said it was very helpful. So I don't recall its name off the top of my head, but I can send that as well.
Well, thank you again, Emily. Well done. I think everyone's starting to chime into the chat. Thank you. An excellent presentation. It's so important. If you'd like to know more about Emily Grijalva and her research, you can check her out on the School of Management website or follow up with the Chloe office. I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and I hope you'll join us next week. We have Richard Gold, President and COO of M&T Bank. He's going to be talking about battling extraneous reinforcers in a remote work environment. So you don't want to miss it. We hope to see you all next week. Have a great week. Thank you again, Emily.
Thanks, guys.